of people involved in physical movement, physical activity, and sport. And to do that, I have this in the Dropbox, but I wanted to show it to you now in this way, because I think it's a little bit more dramatic when you look at it on the big screen. But the Center for Disease Control in the United States does a study almost every year where they measure the body mass index, and they determine how many people are overweight in the United States. And overweight, the number that we're using now is 30 pounds overweight for a person 5'4", all right? So these slides are going to show you the proportion of people who are overweight by state in the United States. And in Brazil, you use the IMC.
Yes.
Okay.
Jay, I didn't understand the concept at 30.
Okay, so for this particular slide, the light blue means that less than 10% are 30 pounds overweight.
30 pounds.
Right. And this, the dark blue, means that 10 to 14% are 30 pounds overweight. Okay, so people in these states, 10 to 14% of them are 30 pounds overweight. So that would be, we would say obese in English. And in these states, it's less than 10%. And in these states, back in 1985, we didn't have data. Okay, so what we're going to see as we go from one year to the next is the states are getting darker and darker blue, all right? So, and then they will become, more states will become yellow, which we'll take a look at what the percentage is for that. But let's just go through these. So 86, 87, 88, 89. So we're still under 14%, okay, even in the darker states, but we're getting more people who are 10 to 14%, 10 to 14% of the people are overweight. Now that's 15 to 19%, the dark, okay? Now we're 1995, 96, 97. Now that's 20% or more, okay? The pink, 20% or more. That's 25%, the red.
The red states.
The red state is, that's Mississippi. So, and this is Colorado. Okay. We're in shape. Now, over 30% of the people are overweight. In the dark red. So in 2010, 30% of the people in these states are 30 30 pounds overweight or more. And in the red, it's 25 to 29%. And in the yellow, it's 20 to 24%. And we have no more blue. So, so the entire country is getting heavier and heavier, fatter and fatter. And we have more health expenses related to this trend. So, but the United States, even though we lead the world, we are #1 in obesity in the world. Although it's difficult to compare countries because we don't keep the same data all the time, but we're right there at the top, and maybe another country is close. Mexico might be close, and England might be close, but we're at the top, and it's creating a problem. But there's other countries now where you would see a lot of red and yellow, and so this is a global issue. It's not just a U.S. issue or an American issue. So this is why more and more people are saying we need to understand how to get people moving, and sport is one of the contexts within which people move. And although I have a little bit of a problem with that too, because in some youth sports in the United States, I don't know enough about Brazil to say this, but in the United States, when you play certain youth sports, you don't move that much. We've done studies of the practices that they have in football, for American football. And what we find is that the children in an hour only move for 15 minutes because they're standing there listening to the coach. And they never even work up a sweat. And in other sports, it's the same way. The coaches are talking too much, and the children are being forced to listen, and they're not moving. And then when they quit, the coach says, I don't know why they quit. I talk to them all the time. And we say that's the problem. So there's more problems than that. But sometimes in sport, you don't get the kinds of movement that you think, especially for children. And so that's one of the reasons why we have these two reports, and why people in other countries are trying to figure out how to get more and more people involved in sport. The other problem in sport is injuries. You know, the more competitive, the more prolific the sport becomes, the higher the injuries. And I don't have great data on this from any country, but I do know that the injury rates in competitive sports are a serious problem now in the U.S. in particular. And many knee operations among 11-year-olds playing soccer, and concussions for children in soccer and in American football. In soccer, now they're eliminating the header in many areas of the country for any child under 14 years old. You can't do any headers. And so that's an issue. In baseball, we have more and more surgeries on the shoulder and the elbow, swimming on the shoulders. In a lot of different sports, your ligaments in your knees. And some of those injuries have long-term implications. So and some of those implications don't show up until later in life. So when I talk to people who are 50 years old, half the people I know who are having surgery, they say it's related to an old sport injury. And I'm thinking, oh, great, now we have healthcare costs related to sport injuries. So maybe we ought to be thinking about the kinds of sports that we want people to participate in. And we should maybe be limiting some of the heavy contact sports and emphasizing sports that involve more rhythmic movements, more movements that involve coordination rather than power. So those are things that we haven't even begun to think about when people get together and say, we have to get more people involved in sport. They just assume, because they accept the great sport myth, that everything is going to be better and perfect if we do sport. So, but we have to look critically at the kinds of sports. So can we switch it? So, what topics do you prefer? Deviance or more on socialization? Should we talk a little bit about what happens in sport? I think that's an important one that we've hit on, but haven't hit on as directly as the chapter does. Oh, these are some fun pictures. So sometimes people end or make changes in their sport participation due to injuries, all right? This was taken by Lara. Yeah, at the 2012 Games in London. Lara Kelly, she's a friend of And ending sport in high school or college doesn't mean that participation is over forever. So I'm interested in more and more in masters events, but not just masters events, because those are pretty competitive. I'm interested in local sport events that involve older people. And this was a group of basketball players who were all over the age of 70, and they were actually going to a national tournament, but it wasn't a Pro-Olympic tournament. This was a tournament where you met other people and you had a good time and you played games. But they would work out 3 times a week, and I went. I used to teach the sociology of aging, and we would go and talk to them about why they were getting involved. And most of them had been involved in basketball when they were younger. That was one of the sports that women could be involved in back in the 1940s and 50s. But it wasn't the basketball that you see today. It was a form of basketball where you could only dribble the ball 3 times. And then you had to stop and pass it. Because if you dribbled more, you'd get tired. And we didn't want women to get too tired. You know, it might harm their uterus. And then they couldn't have children. And what's a woman who doesn't have children? You know, she's useless. So they had, I call it the 3-dribble basketball. So 3 dribbles, but only 3 people could go into the offensive zone, and 3 people go into the defensive zone, because we didn't want women running the whole court. We wanted to make sure that they didn't overexert themselves. So, and they played that form of basketball in the state of Iowa until 2002. And when you read some of the records, there were women who were scoring 100 points in a game. One woman. Because she was the woman who was always in the offensive end. You know, she took all the shots. And she was never tired because she didn't run the whole court. So that was the basketball, the involvement of older people. And all of the research shows that people change their sport participation when their identities change, in connection with developmental issues, with life transitions. You know, when you graduate from school and you know the playing fields are no longer accessible to you, and you're working a full-time job. You know, then you stop, and then you have. If you have a family, then you're focused on the family, and but then when your children get to be 15, 16, 20 years old, or when they leave the house, then you might think about getting back involved in sport, and that happens a lot for people. So So you have to look at sport participation in connection with life transitions. And people quit not because they don't like sport or because they're unhappy with the coach all the time. It's because of other things that are occurring in their lives. So if we want people involved in sports more consistently over time, then we have to figure out what are these life transitions, what kinds of changes occur, and can we start to neutralize some of the barriers so that people can make the choices that they would like to make related to their own physical movement and physical activity and sport participation. So the big issue for me has always been what happens to people involved in sports. You know, because the statement used to be sport builds character. I mean that in English that was just a cliche almost. And it started in England and it came to the United States and Canada, and everybody assumed that if you participated in sport, you had character. You know, there were positive things about you. When I participated in college sport, and I applied to graduate school at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, one of the things that was on my CV was that I played college basketball, and I was a captain of a team, and so on and so forth. And you know, they rated that so highly that they gave me a full fellowship, plus living expenses, plus expenses for my dependent, to get a PhD. Because they thought, oh, Coakley played sport. Now, they looked at my academic record too, but my academic record wasn't that great. And they made that decision because they thought that I had the character that it would take to get through a PhD program. So sometimes the myth works for some people, but that belief is something that I wondered about because I played sports with all sorts of people who had no character. And they were always getting in trouble. In fact, some of the most deviant people I knew were athletes. And they'd get in trouble after games, you know, and they would fight during games. And, you know, we weren't talking about character in the sense that the British were talking about character or other people who had this idea about positive character in sport participation. So I knew that there were some problems with this. And so one of the things that I started to study when I first got through graduate school was what happens to people when they participate in sport. And what I found was that sport participation offers really diverse experiences. And so we can't make generalizations about what happens in sport, because there can be positive experiences and negative experiences. And I had negative experiences in my sport participation. Other people had many more negative experiences than I had, with bad coaches, with parents applying pressure on them, with injuries, with learning things that you would say are deviant. You know, learning how to commit a good foul, for example, in a number of different sports. One of the first things my coach taught me, who ended up being a really well-respected college coach in the United States, one of the first things in basketball was when you play defense and somebody's taking a jump shot, you don't go up, you go up with one hand to try to block the shot. But the other hand, you just hit their elbow. Because the referee is looking at the hand. And the referee is not looking at the elbow. And if you do it right, and we practiced this for a long time, if you do it right, if you just nick the elbow a little bit, it throws the shot out. Amazing. You know, it is really something about how bad the shot is if you just touch the elbow. So we learned that. And then we learned to play to the level of the referee. And we learned all sorts of other ways to commit fouls that would benefit the team. Now, is that character building? You know, many people have had experiences in sport that you wouldn't equate with character. So, and the selection processes in sport favor some characteristics over others. Maybe sport isn't causing character to be developed. Maybe sport is just selecting in certain character. And people that have characteristics that coaches don't like get pushed out, cut, eliminated. And so when I played basketball, the characteristics that I had, the coach valued. So I made the team in high school. My brother, who was a better basketball player than me, taller, stronger, long hair, had a little arrest record, you know, and was pretty defiant. When he tried out, the coach said on the first day of tryouts, this was back when norms related to men's hair were a little different than they are now. The coach said, you know, you could be on this team, but you're going to have to get your hair cut. And my brother said, and how is that going to influence my basketball game? And he said, well, this is the rule of the team. And my brother said, you can take that rule and shove it. And he walked off the court. He never played basketball again, organized basketball. He had a characteristic that didn't get selected in. All right? So did Jay's character get developed in sport, or did Jay have a particular type of character that coaches liked and used it in a positive way in the selection process? So that's an issue that we don't think about, all right, when we talk about what happens to people in sport. And then the meanings that are given to sport experiences vary from one athlete to another. And the lessons learned and the lessons applied vary widely, depending on who your teammates are, who your parents are, who your off-court friends are. All of those things help mediate the meaning of your sport experiences. So if you come off the American football field and everybody thinks you're tough and that you like to be aggressive and fight, some tough guy in the neighborhood might challenge you. And then you get in a fight. So all of a sudden, you know, your life has been influenced by the meanings that somebody else has given your sport experience. Or you may start to, you may play football, American football, and learn that dominating others is a risky thing to do. So that when you're off the field, you're gentle. All right? The only time that you feel that it's appropriate to engage in physical contact that would dominate others is only on the field. Somebody else might learn how to be violent in American football and carry it off the field because it gives them status off the field. So the meanings that are given to sport are going to be different. So one of the things that people think is that boxing teaches people to deal with life crises and decisions with violence. But if you go into a boxing gym like Loïc Lapointe has done from France, who uses Pierre Bourdieu's, he's one of his disciples, uses Bourdieu's theory. He has lived in or not lived, but he participated in a boxing gym in Chicago, in a low-income minority area in Chicago. He was the only white person there. And what he found was that the lessons being learned at that particular gym were that you never, ever used your boxing ability outside the ring. And that these individuals were the least violent people in their neighborhoods because they had learned this philosophy about when the use of your boxing abilities is appropriate and when it isn't. So all the people that thinks boxing turns people into violent people, that's not always true. All right? It may be true in some situations, but most gyms are going to have a culture where they try to keep the violence inside the gym, the boxing abilities inside the gym, not out. So now I have problems with boxing because of brain damage that boxers experience, but a lot of the boxing programs that I know about are really good programs in terms of teaching positive lessons to young people. So, so those meanings are going to vary from one person to another. Okay? And the other thing is, the meanings given to your sport participation change over time. You know, the meanings that I give now as a 71-year-old to basketball that I played when I was 18 to 25 years old are very different than the meanings that I gave to them when I was 25 or 20. So those meanings have changed over time. I now think about my basketball experience in very different ways. I take different things from it than I did when I was younger. So the meanings that are associated with our sport participation are not static. They change over time. And the social relationships that we have mediate our sport experiences and the meanings that we give to them. And the other thing is, the socialization experiences that occur in sport may also be occurring in other situations. And I'll give you an example of why this is important. Most parents never see their children in a math class, all right, or in a science class. So they don't see their child progress from doing this, you know, basic little experiment to doing a pretty complicated experiment when they're in middle school or high school. And if they had seen that, they would say, oh man, my child is really learning in science. Well, but they do see sport. So as their child matures and develops other new characteristics that are positive, maybe because of a good teacher in a math class, or in a science class, or a history class, they see that characteristic manifested in a sport context. So what do they conclude? Sport has built character. When in fact, the character might have been built in a school classroom. But they just see it on the sport field. It may have been built in relationships with their peers, but they see it on the sport field. So they attribute this change to sport, when in fact, sport may have had little or no effect. I'm not saying sport doesn't have an effect. I'm just saying that it's not the only thing that influences how young people develop. So sometimes we think sport is going to make changes that don't always happen, and then we get disappointed. And what do? We blame the child, not how we've done sport. So in other words, that kid is so characterless that they can't even learn the lessons that sport will provide. Right? And so, you know, it is, and they don't think that maybe we ought to change sport in certain ways to intentionally build certain kinds of character traits. You know, because they don't automatically happen. We just assume they automatically happen, and regardless of what kind of sport people participate in, what kind of coach they have, what kind of meanings they're giving to their participation, how their friends and family are defining, mediating that participation, and so on, or the meanings related to their participation. So, so I've looked at literally hundreds of studies of what happens to people in sport, and as far as I can tell, Sport participation is going to produce positive effects when it provides people with opportunities to explore and develop their non-sport identities. Now think about that. Remember yesterday when I said that in some elite sports that young people participate in, they get into a developmental tunnel, and what happens is that all of their focus is on their sport identity, and their coaches and parents say, you don't have time to develop other identities. And so they get into this developmental tunnel. And then when they get to be 24 years old and they end up in a drug rehab program, we say, oh, they just must have been a bad apple, you know, because, man, they participated in sport all those years, they should have had really good character. Well, and they blame the young person rather than blaming this developmental tunnel that's been created in connection with the way sport is organized. So if you're a coach and you want positive things to happen for developmental things to happen for your players, then when you take a trip to another place, you would provide them an opportunity to go to a museum. Meet some people who are, you know, if you're in college, you meet some people who can talk about making the transition from college to the occupational world. And you help try to develop the other identities that you want your players to have if they're going to be effective adults. So I remember Martina Navratilova said she had been to Paris 14 times for the French Open, and she had never been to the Louvre. And I'm thinking, oh, gosh, you know, that's the first place I went when I went to Paris. So, you know, it's like tourists, you know, had experienced much more of Paris than Navratilova had in one visit than she had had in 14. She said, I know the inside of 2 hotels. I know the road that we take, kind of, to Roland Garros Stadium. I know those courts inside out and backwards. I know every square meter of those courts, but I don't know anything else about Paris. And the first thing she did after she retired was she went to Paris and she went to the Louvre. Okay? Because she knew she had some developmental work to do. And that is, she needed more identity. She needed to be able to talk about something other than tennis. She needed to be able to put her tennis playing in a larger perspective. And she was bright enough to figure that out. And she had the resources to do that. But a lot of young people don't. They've been encouraged by messages from the media, by their parents and coaches, to stay in the developmental tunnel. So, but if you want positive impact, then you explore non-sport identities. And you have knowledge-building experiences that go beyond the locker room and the playing field. So, if sport provides you with opportunities to see things and do things that you wouldn't normally have been able to do or see, then sport is going to be a positive thing in your life. Right? If you can develop new relationships with people who are not connected with sports, you know, you build your network. That's positive. If sport gives you an opportunity to do that, if somebody says, oh, you know, Vanderlei, he plays volleyball, I'd like to meet him, but I've never played volleyball, but, you know, I'm a banker. And, you know, so Vanderlei meets a banker and has a new friend, and maybe you can get a loan from him in the future. So, but learns about a different perspective through a non-sport relationship. So if sport provides you with that opportunity, that's great. And I think what's happened as we move more and more to a prolific model, you have fewer and fewer of these exploration, identity development opportunities, fewer knowledge-building experiences outside of sport, and fewer relationships outside of sport. And you know, I played way back in the 60s when it was pre-Prolympic model in a way. I mean, it was very competitive, But if a coach had made the demands on me that coaches are now making on college basketball players, I would quit. There is no doubt in my mind. So, because they are being asked to give more time and energy to their sport now, much more than I was ever asked to do. And when I played, you could actually have a job as an athlete in the United States. Now, if you have a scholarship in a sport, in a Division I, the top sports, you can't work because the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the governing body, says that that's illegal. So when I had my scholarship, the coach made me the manager of the swimming pool. And I opened the swimming pool for people with cerebral palsy, with multiple sclerosis. We changed the temperature of the water. I met all sorts of people in the disability community, what their problems were, when they showed up and when they didn't and why, and all of those things. So it opened up all sorts of opportunities that I would have never had otherwise. Now, that doesn't happen. And so that's a problem. And the other thing is that if you want sport to have a positive impact, then you have to be explicit as a coach or as an administrator about how the lessons learned in sports can be applied to non-sport activities. Everybody says, oh, you build teamwork, discipline, you know the list of things that people say are the characteristics of athletes. But a lot of athletes, when they get to be 22 or 26 or whatever, and they retire from their sports, they have a very difficult time because they know that even though they were able to do something in sport, they haven't had experience to know whether they could do it in any other setting. So in some cases, people will give them a break and hire them, and they'll have a chance to learn and to develop new identity, new relationships, new knowledge, and so on, because they were an athlete. But in many cases, athletes don't test very well when it comes to job qualifications. And so they have never learned how to articulate how the lessons they've learned in sport might transfer to other kinds of settings. And if I tell a coach that they ought to start doing that, helping athletes develop the ability to articulate these connections, they'll tell me, what do you think I am, a social worker? And I say, no, I think you're a leader. In fact, that's what everybody says. Coaches are leaders. And if you're a real leader, then you're preparing people to live in the world, aren't you? And they have a hard time with that because they like to think of themselves as great leaders because they get $10,000 a speech when they go to a corporate banquet to talk about discipline and all these other things, but they're not really leaders because they haven't. Now, I want to change that. Some of them are really good leaders, but many of them have never thought about helping their athletes think about an explicit example of how the lessons learned in sport can be applied to other settings. And I've always said that every sport team membership ought to be accompanied by an academic internship where you combine your connection with sport with your connection with your academic work and an internship in the community where you're working with people understanding things apart from sport. But that's difficult for coaches to get into because they want to control their athletes in sport terms all the time. So, and then opportunities to develop and display competence in non-sport activities become linked with mentors and advocates in the process. So if you can meet mentors and advocates as an athlete who will help you make the transition into the rest of life, then sport has done something positive for you. But if you don't have those mentors, sometimes you feel just like cut off from everything when you retire from sport. Because you have no people. When I was growing up, we used to call them hookups. Now the term is different. But the African American young people that I used to play with on the streets, they would say that they're constantly looking for hookups. And what that meant was that they were looking for someone who could connect them to the world outside of this isolated, resource-deprived, underserved, disadvantaged neighborhood that they lived in. They knew that they were never going to make it there. They needed a hookup to connect with the rest of the world. And if sport can provide you with that hookup, provide that person with the hookup, then that is one of the positive consequences of sport participation. So, and that, we have no way to institute, we have, I don't know, any university in the United States. This is where people are generating all the knowledge related to this. I know of no university that has a formal mentorship program or an advocacy program to connect their athletes with people in non-sport spheres that will help them with the transition into the rest of their lives after they get done playing 4 years of college basketball, soccer, swimming, whatever. So that would be one of the things we do if we're really serious about sport having positive consequences. So questions? So it's more, when we talk about sport being positive developmentally, it's a more complex issue than most people think. And so the general summary now is that negative socialization effects are most likely when playing sports limits or constricts your identities, knowledge, and relationships. But if sport expands them, then the consequences are much more likely to be positive. Right? So, and that's a very simple way to look at things. And if you're a coach or a parent or an athlete, that's a very nice little framework to use in connection with your sport participation or the participation of your players or children. Is you try to make sport such that it's going to expand identities, knowledge, and relationships. And that's a lesson that a lot of people in the current prolific sports system have a difficult time. Do you know any programs where prolific programs where they do any of these things that would expand the positive outcomes associated with sport participation? You know, where clubs, football clubs, for example, would have programs that would help the young people who they're training to develop things apart from their sport participation. You know, because 90% of those young people aren't going to make it. So what's going to happen to them if they've, in your program, if their experiences have been constricted? Well, then, you know, you're just exploiting. So, but, you know, if you're concerned about that 90% who aren't going to make it, then maybe you would have some ancillary programs that would help expand experiences. And it wouldn't necessarily have to interfere with their soccer training, their football training. You know, you could connect people with people in the community. They'd love to meet somebody who's signed by this soccer club. And that person could help this individual at least start to develop a new identity, create new knowledge about something about the world, and have a new relationship. So, but that's relatively rare. Yeah. Oh, yeah. When I said Prolympic, if you weren't here yesterday, Prolympic sports are the power. They're like the power and performance sports that are described in chapter 3. Okay? They're sports that are exclusive and emphasize outcomes. And they're contrasted with pleasure and participation sports, or what I called in our session yesterday, people's sports, that are process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented, and they're inclusive rather than exclusive. So now, we're talking about a continuum here where we get mixtures of things, but Prolympic sports are the hegemonic sports in the world today. In other words, when people think about, when I say the word sports, I would guess that 90% of you in here would think of Prolympic sports. And you would think of especially the top level of Prolympic sports. And the top football or soccer leagues, the things that you see on television. So I try to get people to think about other sport forms as well. So I like this picture. This is Ronda Rousey. Any of you who followed mixed martial arts knows that she is defined by many people as unbeatable, and in the cage, and in ultimate fighting. And the power and performance sports involve very different kinds of experiences than pleasure and participation sports. And we can't say that somebody who engages in recreational climbing is learning the same lessons as Ronda Rousey, or is even close. I mean, those experiences are so different. But interestingly, it would be theoretically possible for Ronda Rousey to learn lessons in her mixed martial arts experience that are very similar to the lessons that somebody might be learning in climbing. Depends on the kinds of meanings that people are attributing to their sport and how they're interpreting it and how they're integrating it into their lives. But usually power and performance sports come with a different set of experiences than pleasure and participation sports. Okay, so we're going to skip through these. And this sets up things for our future classes. Is how does sport affect our lives? Sports do affect our lives. I mean, I don't want you to leave here thinking Coakley said that nothing happens to people in sports. That's not true. Okay? But what I'm saying is we've got to look at the conditions under which some things are more likely or less likely to happen in sports. But people define and give meaning to sports experiences in connection with their social relationships. And those meanings given to sport experiences are in part grounded in cultural definitions related to the things that we're going to be talking about: gender, race and ethnicity, social class, ability, disability, and other characteristics that are defined as socially important in a particular culture. So women may be learning very different kinds of things in sport than men are. People from low-income groups maybe looking at sport, experiencing sport, and learning things in sport that are very different than people who come from high-income backgrounds. So those factors and the cultural definitions related to them affect the kinds of meanings that we give to sport. So when somebody from a really low-income family in the United States gets a 4-year scholarship in American football to Ohio State University, that means something to that person that is totally different than what sport means to the person who just got a swimming scholarship from a family that makes $500,000 a year and has been involved in swimming clubs and high-income settings their entire life. You know, the meaning that that person will give to their swimming experience, very, very different than the meaning that that low-income individual is going to give to their football experiences and the opportunities associated with it. So those are going to vary depending on gender and the other factors. Okay, so I don't want the session to disappear without talking a little bit about deviance. This is, by the way, one of the things that I notice when I go to a game. All right. So you know, if I go to a baseball game right away, and this drives people crazy too. You know, I'll count the number of spaces that don't have a corporate message on it, of some sort or another. And if you go to the Pepsi Center in Denver, where the Denver Nuggets and the Avalanche, the hockey team, play, I will give you $100 if you can find a space as big as this door that isn't filled with a corporate logo or a logo associated with the team. I mean, the messages are just everywhere. And you know, one of the questions I asked people, one of the things I wanted them to think about in my classes was, what if all of the sport broadcasts of the NFL games in the United States were sponsored by labor organizations rather than multinational corporations? Would the broadcasts change in any way if they were sponsored by labor? Oh yeah, they would. You know, instead of talking about the wonders of the coach as the corporate leader and the owners who have put together this wonderful team, they'd be talking about the laborers and the kinds of issues that exist in the laborers' lives. And if that actually happened in the United States, everybody would say, boy, is this a biased broadcast? You know? I mean, these labor unions, they've taken over the world. I mean, you just can't get away from their messages. Or what if all the broadcasts were sponsored by environmental organizations or women's organizations? You know, the first thing we'd hear is, you know, these commentators are really biased. But you know what's happened? Is that we have become so accustomed to having corporate images, names, and messages associated with sports that when those corporations are delivering messages that are in their interests to us, we don't see them as biased. We just see them as normal. In other words, corporate sponsors have normalized our commitment to corporate messages and our acceptance of corporate messages. That's why they spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year sponsoring sport. Because they know, like the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci said, that if you want to develop consent in the people over whom you rule or control or want to dominate, what you do is instead of sending the military out there to shoot rubber bullets at them, or instead of coercing them, what you do is you sponsor their pleasure and excitement. Now, the Romans knew this a long time ago. Okay? So, if you can sponsor people's pleasure and excitement, they are less likely to be critical of you. And that's why McDonald's and Coca-Cola are the biggest sponsors of the Olympics. Why? Because McDonald's and Coca-Cola know that their products are unhealthy and will destroy people physically. You know, if that's all you rate, all right? And Coca-Cola will rot out your teeth. It provides you with 30 plus grams of sugar in every 12-ounce can. And it provides you with other chemicals and so on that are not good for you. So how are we going to sell a product like that and keep people from objecting when we expand into Africa and give people Coke instead of water? How are we going to do that? Well, I'll tell you what, we'll sponsor their pleasure and excitement in the form of the Olympics. And then, when people hear those messages from McDonald's and Olympics in connection with McDonald's and Coca-Cola in connection with the Olympics and General Motors and the other big atmosphere-polluting automobiles and trucks, people are less likely to be critical of those corporations when we know, as the IOC tells us, that Coca-Cola brings us the Olympics. And without Coca-Cola and McDonald's, we wouldn't have the Olympics as they are today. And those are actual, that's a paraphrase, but that's actual quotes from IOC members. Is if you're an IOC person or associated with the Olympics, you better not badmouth McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Mars Candy, the official candy confectionery of the Olympics, or this team or that team, because anybody that's selling a product that has questionable moral or health value to it will sponsor sports. Because they know that that's one way to diffuse objections to the products that they have. So, and when I say that, it makes some people kind of nervous, because they have accepted those messages their entire lives. And the commentators, by the way, if the commentators said anything that would interfere with Coke sales, they would be gone tomorrow. On any NFL game, any Major League Baseball game, any Olympic event, if any of those announcers said anything that would interfere with somebody buying a Big Mac and fries and supersizing it or whatever, they would be fired. They would be fired. But, so those are the kinds of things that sociology theory has, theories in sociology have made me aware of when I go to a game and see all those corporate logos. And nobody even notices them anymore, they say. But they're there. And as I point out in the book, you know, it's hard to fight enemies that have outposts in your head. And that's what commercials do, is they try to establish outposts in your head that will be little terminals that will help deliver other pro-corporate messages. And our sports today depend on that. So, you know, we're in an interesting situation. So you accept the corporations because you want the sports. And they're everywhere. So beer, alcohol is the other one that's always, beer is advertised in connection with sports. There's not a rule against that in Brazil, is there? Yeah, we couldn't advertise hard liquor, like Jack Daniels, you know, whiskeys and so on. We can't do that on television sports now, on the major networks. They do it on some of the cable channels, and they've changed that rule. Sports Illustrated and other magazines and newspapers really debated that, and they said, you know, we can't publish our magazine unless we advertise hard liquor. And because they're paying a third of our costs on Sports Illustrated. So, so those producers of those kinds of products know that they've got to diffuse moral objections and health objections, and that's why they sponsor. That's why they sponsor the sports. So I'm even sitting too long. So, and I'd love to talk about doping, but you know, I don't want to keep you any longer. So we can talk about, we'll talk a little bit about deviance at the beginning of the class next time. And I would respond to questions, so make sure you write them down, because I guess what I'll say is I won't talk about deviance unless you have questions. And then we'll move into issues related to gender and race and ethnicity. But if you bring in questions, if you want to know about athletes doing performance-enhancing substances or anything like that, we can talk about some of the research related to that, and some of the conceptual frameworks, and some of the enforcement frameworks that are being used. WADA, for example, which is almost totally useless. But the kind of enforcement that we do in connection with performance-enhancing substance right now is a failure. It's a disaster. And we say, oh, cycling has cleaned up. Well, cyclists have learned to do pharmacology in different ways now. And people are learning about substances that WADA doesn't even know about. Right? And they're getting them from parts of the world where WADA people have never walked. And so the kinds of performance-enhancing substances, and by the way, when I use that term in the book, I'm not just, I hate the term doping, but because doping, you know, ties the use of substances to this legendary form of deviance that people have moral panics about in almost every culture. So, so I use the term performance-enhancing substances because almost every athlete I know of any age is using performance-enhancing substances of some sort. They're using anti-inflammatories, they're using sport drinks, they're using power bars, they're using other kinds of energy-producing substances, they're using caffeine suppositories, 72 cups in one suppository. They're using caffeine to mask various kinds of anabolic steroids. They're using human growth hormones in stacked and cycled dosages so that they can't be detected by the technology that we have right now. And all of those technologies the people who use them have to make decisions about how many false positives can they tolerate and how many people do they want to catch and how many false negatives are they going to tolerate. So they always set those limits. You know? So when you're taking testosterone, if you're at the USOC, if you're an athlete in the United States and you have access to resources, you know how to get your epi-tet ratio right up to the limit that's legal, which is about 3 times the limit of normal. So, so there's all sorts of people who are doing this. So the big question is, should we call them all cheaters, right, like Lance Armstrong? Or is there maybe a problem with the way cycling is organized, where you have to work out 8 hours a day of intense workouts that are destroying muscle tissue, right? And you need to recover in order to be ready to compete. How are you going to do that? And then your competitions are being scheduled so frequently that you can't recover from one competition to another. How are you going to do that? Well, the athletes and the sport medicine people who work with athletes and other people who outside athletic federations who work with athletes know how to help athletes recover. And for most of those athletes, they don't use anabolic steroids as a performance-enhancing substance. They use it as a training aid. Because when you use it, you can train for 8 hours instead of 6 at a level of intensity of 95 rather than 65. So that's, so most of the athletes who I know who are using performance-enhancing substances are using them as training aids so that they will be ready for competition. They don't call them performance-enhancing. They see them as body regenerating. But we've developed this label that we put on them, and in fact, the people who are using these substances are the hardest workers. They're the most dedicated. They see the game as being important, but in order to survive and in order to maintain their athlete identity, they've got to be able to recover. They've got to be able to train at that level of intensity. They've got to be able to be ready for the next competition, even though they have no control over the fact that they're competing twice as much as they should be. And they're training twice as many hours a week as are healthy for their bodies. And when WADA tells you that they're enforcing the drug rules because they're concerned with the health of athletes, that's a joke. Because the federations are destroying the health of athletes in many cases by expecting them to train intensely more than 20 hours a week, which is not good for your body. After that, some people even say 15 hours of intense training a week. After that, you're destroying muscle tissue. So you need time to recuperate. But you don't get time. So how are you going to stay involved? And that's the dilemma that a lot of athletes are facing. And I'm not saying every athlete is taking something illegal, but every athlete who's in the Olympics from a country that has a GDP, that averages out to more than $2 a day a person, the athletes have access to substances that will help them train. So, a quick example, at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, where I lived for 33 years, I taught courses there to the athletes because their schedules didn't permit them to go to a regular semester course. So I would go to the training center and I would get people from 3 sports that had the same kinds of competition schedules and travel schedules, and then we'd do a class so that they could get college credit while they were involved in their sports. And so I'd find out that they were going to this warehouse that was a supplement warehouse in Colorado Springs, and I would go with the athletes from the different sports and watch them shop. They'd go down the aisles with, all the protein things and all of the other energy-inducing things and creatine and other substances. And I would see what they would buy, what the boxers would buy, what the swimmers would buy, what the team handball players would buy, and so on. And they were all spending between $200 and $800 a month, 15 years ago, on supplements in order to keep going. And that's why we have more 40-year-olds playing sport today. It's not because they're just lifting more weights, by the way. Dara Torres in the Olympics from the United States, 42 years old, winning a medal. She did not win that medal because she's in the pool longer than others. She won it because she knows how to manage her body. And she manages her body with all sorts of substances, other than a normal diet. So is that cheating? Where do we draw the line between the substances that are permitted? If I take 6 Advil or ibuprofen so to control my pain so I can go out in the field, or if I'm an NFL player and I take a big shot of Toradol into my hip, it's the most effective anti-inflammatory in the world, just so I can get out on the field every Sunday, is that a performance-enhancing substance? You better believe it is, but it's not illegal, and it is dangerous, by the way. And it's more dangerous than testosterone. So who makes the decisions about what you can take, what you can't take, what's legal, what isn't legal, what's natural, what isn't natural, and what's dangerous and what isn't dangerous when you're already doing a sport where the risk of injury and damage to your body is really high. So it's no wonder that a lot of athletes will say, you know, I will take a substance even if it takes 5 years off of my life, because I'm already putting my knees on the line every time I practice. I'm putting my brain on the line for Pete's sake. So I'll give up 5 years. So if I can take something that will help me right now. So, sorry to give you, but that's, we can talk a little bit about some of those issues if you want at the beginning of the session. We'll talk about gender and race and ethnicity. So thanks for listening.